Yes, good evening, everyone. It's now 6:05, and I think this is a good moment to start. My name is Andreas Bieler. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice, and it's my privilege to chair tonight's talk by esteemed Professor William Robinson. Now, William is a professor of sociology at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And he really made his mark, you may correct me with that, William, he made his mark already way back in 1996 with his book Promoting Polyarchy, which identified a shift in official US foreign policy, away from supporting dictatorships towards promoting democracy, but a democracy actually which ensured that the traditional America-friendly elites remained in place. Since then, William Robinson has significantly shaped the development of international political economy, the study of global capitalism. He was amongst the first who talked about this emergence of a new transnationalist capitalist class fraction becoming dominant at the global level. And he also coined the notion and the concept of the transnational state, consisting of these fractions and various state apparatuses. And over the years, there have been many books discussing the ongoing developments in the global economy. And from a recent online publication, I just want to read the first sentence because I think that really describes well his approach to social science, where he says, "One of the hallmarks of radical social science is to place the noisy abode of headlines and the swirl of current events in a larger historical and structural context that give them proper meaning." And it's precisely this why, in my view, William Robinson is really one of the best contemporary Marxist observers and commentators on developments in the global political economy. More recent books precisely trying to capture what's happening at the moment are Can Capitalism Endure by Clarity Press. I'm going to put the link in the text after the talk, so for you to catch up with that. And he's also recently published some selected writings on war, global capitalism, and resistance with resistance books. And these two, a link to that I'm going to put in the chat after the discussion. Now, of course, when we think about dramatic global developments, nothing more epitomizes that than the atrocities, the genocide, or also referred to scholasticide, we are currently experiencing day in, day out, live in front of us. The genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, but of course also ultimately in the West Bank. And so it's particularly an opportune moment to have you with us, William, and to give us your insights on the global meaning of Gaza. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Andreas, for that generous introduction. Thank you, Andreas, and to the Center for this invitation. I'm honored to be with you today. And it's so wonderful to see Andreas on the screen because we met in person. We just identified, I think, the first time 21 years ago. And while we've been in touch, we haven't seen seen each other since then. So I'm going to jump right into this. I want to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And I normally I use PowerPoints for my courses, but otherwise I never use PowerPoints on these types of professional presentations, but I made an exception because I think today the images are very important. So I'm gonna jump right into this. I have a lot to cover and I want to speak for about maybe 40 to 45 minutes. I think over the last 14 months, we've reached an historic turning point in terms of, well, everything going on, of course, in Palestine and the world, but also specifically with what we can call now the global intifada in solidarity with Palestine. October 7 and the last 14 months and this intifada of solidarity is really for me a catalyst for something much bigger that I want to go into now. But I want to start by saying that in my analysis, genocidal pressures they're actually built into the Zionist project, and also now built into global capitalism in deep crisis. And so this moment would have eventually come absent one of two things happening: either that the Zionist project is defeated, or that the United States ends its unconditional support for Israel. So the big question is, why genocide, but why now? And my answer to that is the genocide is triggered in the larger context by the global crisis, and that 7 October of 2023 is, of course, what we call in the social sciences a precipitating event, the one that sparked it, but not the underlying explanation. So we're in this, for many of us, a multi-dimensional crisis of global capitalism, really something which is a crisis which is completely unprecedented. And, we talk about in the radical social sciences, three types of crises. They're cyclical, that is about every 10 years, like clockwork. We get a recession, a downturn. In bourgeois economics, it's called the business cycle. And we are not right now in a cyclical crisis, and something much bigger, which is the next type.
Apologies, William, for
Yes?
interrupting. If you could just please also switch on your video, so when you present, we can also see your face, and that's also being recorded.
Yes, except I don't know how to. I have no control over that. The image.
We can see you. Perfect.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the second type of crisis, the much more serious one, is structural crisis. And these take place about every 4 to 50 years. There's a lot of theorizing in the long waves of capitalist crisis. So I'm suggesting we are in a deep structural crisis right now. I call it a restructuring crisis, because the only way to resolve a structural crisis is through a very radical restructuring of how worldwide capitalism is working. We had structural crises in the 1830s, then the late 1870s to the early 1990s. Then, of course, in the 1930s, the next big structural crisis was the 1970s, and it's the response. Out of that structural crisis emerged transnational capitalist globalization as a response to that crisis. But then in my analysis, 2008, the global financial collapse starts the next big structural crisis, and we are still in that crisis. It is not resolved. It's more severe than the earlier ones for reasons I'll very briefly touch on. And if we look in the short term, it was resolved as if it's a cyclical crisis. Growth rates, resumed in the 2010s, but from the structural perspective, we're still deep in that crisis. And I'm suggesting that we are moving towards a systemic crisis, meaning a crisis so severe, so profound, that the only way to resolve it is to move beyond the system. I suggest to you that we are arriving at the historic exhaustion of the conditions for capitalist renewal. And 4 dimensions here I want to highlight of this crisis. The first is over accumulation. By the way, I'm going to speak a little considerable detail here about this multidimensional crisis, but then go much quicker when we turn towards Palestine. So we know the overproduction of capital is internal to capitalist dynamics itself, and that surplus capital has reached these extraordinary levels that we have simply never seen before. What's happened in the last couple of decades is that transnational corporations and financial conglomerates, they've registered these unbelievable record profits, but at the same time, the rate of profit has steadily fallen. I'm not going to present here the data for that, and corporate investment has declined. But precisely a sign of capitalist breakdown is this situation where you have a decrease in the rate of profit simultaneous to an increase in the whole mass of profit. So the 2,000 largest corporate and financial conglomerates around the world are sitting on these massive quantities of idle cash. And that idle cash went from $6.6 trillion in 2010 to $14.2 trillion in 2020. So, it's almost tripled in just 10 years. So the global economy faces these long-term structural stagnation, and companies have been retaining rather than reinvesting their profit. And you'll see in a moment why this is so important with regard to Palestine. But listen to this striking data. Since 1980, corporate cash holdings have ballooned, just holding on to cash, from to 10% of the GDP in the United States, 22% in Western Europe, 34% in South Korea, 47% in Japan. So this gives you an idea of this deep structural level of the crisis. And remember, when money is idle, when it's not being reinvested and accumulated, that is a crisis. A state of stasis is a state of crisis. So that's the first big dimension. We'll see this relation to Palestine in a moment. The second dimension of the multidimensional crisis is of social polarization and social reproduction worldwide. Surplus capital finds its alter ego in surplus labor. And we've seen the expansion of the ranks of surplus labor to something we've never seen before in history, what I call and others call now surplus humanity. At least 2 billion people, according to ILO data, are simply locked out and marginalized from the global economy and global society. And as we are right now on the cusp of a new digital revolution, that's only going to increase the ranks of surplus humanity. And you're all familiar with the data on extreme inequality. Oxfam's 2018 report said 1% of humanity has 52% of the world's wealth, 20% that can survive in global capitalism has 95% of the world's wealth, and 80% of humanity has to make do with just 5% of that world's wealth. That was 2018, and it's gotten significantly more severe global inequality in the last 7 years. So the response from above, from transnational capital, has been a wild financial speculation, debt-driven growth, and the plunder of public finances as temporary fixes to this crisis of stagnation and over-accumulation. But right now, what we're seeing, and this is the entry point into talking about the Middle East and Gaza, is that the transnational capitalist class and their political agents in states and institutions, they're in this desperate search for new outlets to unload all of this surplus accumulated capital. And this leads the system to become ever more violent, predatory, and reckless, and to search for how to resolve this crisis. So it's also a political crisis of state legitimacy and capitalist hegemony and geopolitical confrontation. And this is part of the story of this turn to far-right populism and really to fascism as a response to the multidimensional crisis, including these political dimensions. And of course, it's a crisis of the planetary ecosystem, which makes this existential. Andreas invited me to do this talk after I published an article titled Global Capitalism Extermination Impulse. And this is, I just want to literally quote myself, just why I titled it like that, and a link to Palestine. Palestine shows us both the past and the future, a redux of the dark history of European colonialism that reached its zenith in the 19th and 20th centuries, and also a ghastly glimpse into the future of a global capitalism whose extermination impulse is rising to the surface in the face of this unprecedented crisis. So I want to talk now about the political economy of Israeli genocide, specifically asking why genocide, why now, what next? And I'm going to cover these 6 different dimensions. They're all interrelated. It's kind of just for methodological purposes to separate them out. And the first of these is what I call Israel's demographic crisis. This is the Zionist version of what we call here in the United States, and I believe you have in Europe also, this notion of replacement theory, that in the United States, the ethnic white population is becoming a numerical minority, and far-right racist forces have mobilized with this concept of replacement theory, saying we will not be allowed to be a minority, we will not be replaced by the masses of people that are non-white. So we have the Zionist version here. The self-declared Jewish state sees that Jews must be a majority. But they're not. They're actually a slight minority right now. And so, numerically speaking. So what we see is that each time the Palestinians threaten to be a numerical majority, we've had a new round of ethnic cleansing, intensified repression, and occupation. Now, this goes back for quite a number of years. For the last 20 years, really, this is not new. And in recent years, so part of this is explained because in recent years, there's been increased Jewish out-migration and very little in-migration. The last major wave of in-migration was 1 million, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1 million Soviet Jews in the 1990s moved into Israel. Since then, there's been very little in-migration. And the Palestinian birth rate is higher than the Jewish birth rate. So these demographic pressures are part of the story of the rise of the current far-right fascist government in Israel, which is really more and more desperate to, quote, resolve the Palestinian problem. So we've seen a radical escalation of settlements, attacks, the buildup of genocidal pressures before October 7, 2023. Of course, the right-wing, extreme right-wing government of Netanyahu comes to power in early 2023, and you see the escalation of attacks, of aggression, of pushes to escalate settlements and so forth. But even before then, that was happening. Another factor in this matter, though, is also that there's increasing inequality and polarization among the Jewish population inside Israel. Jewish workers are suffering, and the Zionist state has a problem of how do you channel their demands for improvement in their situation, and part of that is to send them into the settlements. Part of that, of course, is to manipulate and whip up more anti-Palestinian hatred. And thing I want to say is that Israel passed this law on November 7, which is just 2 weeks ago, saying that it would deport its own Arab citizens with Israeli passports living inside Israel if their relatives are so-called terrorists. And that has a bigger explanation. It's people thought that it had to do with Gaza, but the larger story here, this is simply an excuse to continue to reduce the Palestinian population now by deporting those actually inside Israel with citizenship. So this obviously is a refugee camp that's British soldiers expelling Palestinians in 1948, and that's the Bethlehem refugee camp. And then I took that photo in 2015, the same camp, the people are still there. But the reason I'm mentioning this now is that if these refugees returned, the Jewish state, self-declared Jewish state, would collapse. It would be a very small minority. There are 7 million Palestinians in Palestine, 48 Palestine. There's 7 million Jews, and then there's 6 million Palestinians in the diaspora. So we've been, and remember, UN Resolution 194, approved in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel, and reiterated every single year, including this year 2024, says those refugees, all the way going back to 1948, have a right to return and to be compensated for the property they lost, return to Israel proper. So that is why we've been seeing these attacks on UNRWA. Israel has, and the West has really never wanted UNRWA because it recognizes that right to return, which is the threat to demographic threat to Israel. And so the genocide is an excuse now to completely demolish UNRWA. And so that's the larger story here of that. So expanding, we all know these images, but this radical expansion of settlements and aggression in the West Bank and also in Gaza before October 7, 2023, in the lead up to that, was already taking place. And in my view, Israel was just looking for an excuse to launch genocide, to radically escalate what is basically occupation and turn it into genocide one way or another. And I just want to make sure you can still all hear me. Are we okay, Andres?
Yeah,
Andres?
all good. All good.
So
Thank you.
The second of these 6 points, I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. Without skimping on the most important, is that Palestinians now, the Palestinian proletariat is surplus humanity. So we've analyzed the crisis previously, and as I've explained, we see this worldwide expansion of surplus humanity. And wherever there's a massive buildup of surplus humanity, and on the other side of whatever demarcation there is, whether it's a physical or a juridical demarcation, is other zones in the global economy which are involved in intense accumulation, they become zones of death and destruction. So the US-Mexico border is a zone of death and destruction and violence all the time. There's thousands and thousands of deaths along that border, and migrants making the trek to that border from further down south. The Mediterranean, you guys from where you are, you know this very well. It's a zone of death and destruction where surplus humanity is facing a zone of intense accumulation. But it's not just those two areas. We know that the Saudi regime employs several millions of foreign workers, which have no rights whatsoever, including 750,000 Ethiopians. And what was lost in the news earlier in 2024 is that another group of Ethiopians was migrating and in the mountains trying to cross completely peaceful, armless, virtually barefoot refugees try and get work there. We see this worldwide. We see this buildup of global capitalism's extermination impulse. And in some of these cases, this involves an ethnic dimension to extermination. That's very important. And we speak in radical sociology, social sciences, at least two types of structures of ethnic oppression. And one of them is when we can call disorganization of the working class and super exploitation. It's when you have a working class, but there's an ethnically subordinate sector of the working class subject to super exploitation and super control. And that's one. The second type of ethnic structure of ethnic oppression we see as exclusion. That's when the ruling groups need the resources of those ethnically or racially oppressed, but not their labor. So in the United States, historically, Black people were in that first category. They're part of the working class after the Civil War. They're super exploited and subject to racist controls, but part of the working class. Native Americans here in North America were the exclusion. Their land was needed, but not their labor, because we had African slaves and European immigrants. And so they're subject to genocide. So with the case of Israel, we have an historic tension between these two structures. On the one hand, the Zionists, the Israelis, they expropriate the Palestinians and they exclude them. That leads to ethnic cleansing, the creation of a Jewish-only state, and pressures towards genocide. The other side has always also been present, because this is contradictory in Israel. You have expropriation of the Palestinians, but you have their super exploitation as workers. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians go into Israel and work in construction and work especially in agriculture and so forth. And so you've always had that tension between whether you should expropriate and exclude or expropriate and super exploit. And so now what we're seeing is that tension is being revolved in favor of exclusion and therefore genocide. 1993 was the closure policy, when Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank are simply locked in, and the border wall, the apartheid wall, begins to be built. And Israel turns to now, instead of using Palestinian labor, using transnational migrant labor. Of course, transnational migrant workers coming from the Philippines, from India, from Sri Lanka, from Pakistan, from Ethiopia, and from elsewhere, they have no claims to land or to estate, so they are preferable. Note that on October 7, there were, I think, 100 and some odd, or 70 and 79, I think is the figure, Filipinos, Thais, Nepalese, were also killed in the Hamas attack on October 7. And right after October 7 happened, the last 10,000 Gazan workers that are working inside Israel deported back to Gaza. They will not go back into Israel ever. And also the West Bank workers are closed off. One construction company asked the government after October 7 for permission to import up to 100,000 Indian workers. And this is a larger phenomenon. In the Middle East and North Africa, we had a situation, especially the Gulf states, where you have 50 to 90% of the population are migrant workers. Now, previously, a lot of Palestinians were those migrant workers in Saudi Arabia, in the oil fields, and so forth. But starting in the 1990s and into the 2000s, the Gulf regimes, instead of having Palestinian workers who can identify culturally, who might demand rights, who want to bring their families, you have this massive switch over to transnational migrant labor from faraway reaches of the world that can be super controlled, super exploited like virtual slaves. So that's really the model worldwide. We're moving towards that in the United States. That's why Trump is saying he's going to deport everybody, because they'll come back in as virtually enslaved labor like the Gulf model. So this is worldwide. But the point is now, the classic example here is Palestinians are now totally, world capitalism has no use for them. So the Gazan option becomes genocide. To quote myself here, Gaza becomes a real-time alarm bell. Genocide is a political tool for resolving ruling class problems of surplus humanity. What happens to Palestine happens to humanity. So the occupied territories are a giant supermax prison for surplus humanity. On the left here, you see that's Gaza. And of course, these Palestinian men, they could be nurses and hospital workers that have nothing to do with armed resistance, are stripped to their underwear, held there, and then later on they're taken off to detention because they're simply surplus humanity. And if you look on the bottom right of my screen, I hope my image is not blocking it, you see a similar thing, stripped to your underwear, and armed soldiers guarding those people. But that is not Gaza. That is El Salvador. And in 2023, last year, El Salvador built the biggest prison in the world called Center for the Confinement of Terrorism. Nothing to do with terrorism. Those are young young men who are total surplus humanity. They cannot get jobs, they cannot get education, they have to get rid of. So they're locked up with 40,000 prisoners, the first of its kind in the world. So what we're seeing is the ruling classes have this problem of how you deal with surplus humanity all around the world. And part of that is pressures towards genocide. So the ruling classes have two options. They have the Gaza option, outright genocide, or they have the Salvadoran option, lock up in massive supermax prisons and locate them far away. And so we see the worldwide spread of supermax prisons. Remarkably, right after El Salvador opened that supermax, 40,000 prisoners, Brazil, China, Turkey, Thailand, the Philippines, India, other countries announced plans to build similar ones. And so here you see being built this one in Turkey. So this is a new stage of how the ruling groups need to escalate what they're and decide what they're going to do with surplus humanity that cannot be absorbed. This is not just the old reserve army of labor. This is something much bigger. So the third of these six is, and I'm speaking fast to try and make up for lost time. The third of these six is
William, we have enough time, so you can slow down. We
thank you
go
so
a bit
much.
over. No pressure.
Great, thank you. So the third is what I've called and laid out in more detail in my book, The Global Police State, came out in 2020, militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. So this, one of the responses, one of the things that's come out of this severe crisis of overaccumulation and stagnation, and the rise of surplus humanity and mass discontent worldwide is what I refer to as the global police state, in which systems of warfare, social control, and repression become now major mechanisms of accumulation and of worldwide social control. We're living in a global war economy. Now, we've had since post-World War II, of course, we've had the Keynesian mechanism of military spending. And we've had what back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, people called the permanent arms economy. Well, we still have this, but global police state is much more than that. It's qualitatively new stage in what I'm referring to here. And what we see is that Israel is at the very heart of the global police state, of the global military industrial surveillance, high-tech homeland security complex. Israel is a totally militarized economy. There's two dimensions. It used to be until the globalization transformations of the 1990s, substitution and high tech software and everything, Silicon Valley, it's on Silicon Valley. And so in this context, repression of Palestinians become big business. There's already been several books published that how new weapon systems are first tested on the Palestinians before they are exported around the world with the label attached to them, battle tested, that is on Palestinians. So the Israeli political economy thrives on war and on conflict. And because Israel is also a leader in artificial intelligence, we're going to see in just a moment the transformation of war and conflict into artificial intelligence warfare now being practiced, and its debut and inaugurated on the world scene in Gaza. And this is also why, of course, Israel gives crucial far-right support to far-right fascist militaries and dictatorships all around the world. That's been going on for decades. But this is also why the genocide started, boom to militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. And as others have pointed out, the distinction between wars within nations and between nations is ever less meaningful. So really, Gaza is a transnational conflict. It is a transnational genocide. And as I put here, as the global economy stagnates, genocide becomes enormously profitable and attractive. It resolves political and economic problems for ruling groups. And I put here globalization of late Victorian holocausts. What I'm getting at there is that Mike Davis wrote his famous book, and we know that at certain times in the colonial history of India, when the surplus population was simply too vast to even need to have them stay there as an industrial reserve army, famines hit, or what really happens is that the British colonialists remove the resources out of India and send them elsewhere. And so the colonial authorities simply let millions and millions of Indians just die. So we're now seeing the globalization of this model of the late Victorian Holocaust in India and elsewhere. So social control, repression, warfare, genocide becomes enormously profitable and also politically useful for a global capitalism in deep and unprecedented crisis. And here Israel is really a model of the global police state, and which shouldn't be surprising that the US Israel trains US police forces, and worldwide, Israel is a key prop for suppression and control of surplus humanity. That's me in front of the checkpoint in Hebron, going into the settler area, and inside they have this graffiti, Gaza, gas the Arabs. And this is way before 2024, this is 2015. Again, the extermination impulse building up and building up and building up. And of course, this extreme high-tech, artificial intelligence-driven social control developed to a maximum in Israel is a model for the rest of the world. So on the top, you see Little Gaza. So that's not Gaza itself. What the IDF did is build a miniature version of Gaza City in the Negev desert and practiced what it's doing right now in Gaza. It practiced that urban warfare and that genocide in Little Gaza before it actually went into Gaza and did it in real life. And on the bottom, we have Cop City. Some of you may have heard of that. It's this massive police training complex outside of Atlanta, Georgia, here in the United States. And there's massive protests against it. And they're training police forces there for urban warfare, for really to be paramilitary, virtual military forces rather than typical patrol polices. And the point is, it was modeled after and advised by the Israelis and what they did in Little Gaza. And here in the United States, we've had 300 anti-terrorism laws, 42 of them approved at state level, 42 of them approved in 21 states to repress Palestine solidarity. So again, this is a transnational conflict. So what we're seeing with this problem of surplus humanity for the ruling groups and also for this extreme social polarization worldwide is new geographies of containment, and what I call global green zoning, again with Palestine as the model, with high-tech global police state inside and outside of the green zones. So here is this is Baghdad. You may remember that in 2003, the US invades and occupies Iraq, and they set up this impenetrable barrier with blast walls and digital walls and create this green zone. Inside the green zone, who goes in there? Well, the new Iraqi political and economic elite and wealthy strata brought to power by the U.S. invasion, also the CEOs and representatives of the transnational corporations pouring into Iraq post-invasion, and of course the officers and commanders of the U.S. military force. So you have the good life there in the green zones, and outside what I call the gray zones and the open war zones, you have massive death and destruction. So the whole world is becoming green zoned and gray zoned. Surplus humanity, poor workers on the outside, and the privileged 20% inside the green zone, and the 1% ruling class, if we want to use that language. So this is that bombing and destruction, that is not Gaza, that is Iraq. So what you see in the center of the screen, my iPen is also not working, so I can't mark it up. You see musical concerts, swimming pools, that's high-end condominium construction going on. That's an upscale mall. You can be anywhere in the world for rich people. And that's inside the green zone. On my right-hand top side, you see the line between the green zone and the masses of Iraqis, the soldiers there blocking the green zone entrance. You see death and destruction outside of the green zone on the left-hand side, top and bottom. And there you see the wall itself, block the green zone and the rest of Iraq, of Baghdad being bombed and destroyed. So again, green zoning and gray zoning is a worldwide, we're moving towards this fortress world. This is an image of how the global police state operates, but it's also, but both accumulation and keeping out surplus humanity, protecting those inside the green zone. And Palestine, again, is the model here. We have, of course, facial recognition and panoptic global surveillance. We have these new digitalized modalities of mass social control. And the occupied Palestinian territories is once again key over here. China is the most advanced country in the world for the development of these facial recognition technologies, and China supplied these technologies to Israel for use in the West Bank. I want to say something else. When we had our encampments, over 200 universities set up their encampments here in the United States last spring. And Mossad, at one point, and this is a real treat by Mossad, sent to those students, sent this message through Twitter. Facial recognition can determine whether you participated in pro-Hamas protests at universities. Your jobs and your degrees will be worthless. Your hiring opportunities will be limited. So here we see Mossad literally gets facial recognition of those students at these encampments and can threaten them as part of this phenomenon that we're analyzing. So Gaza and Lebanon, these are the first artificial intelligence wars of the 21st century. What we've seen, and many of you know this already, that private global high-tech corporations are fused with. They're part of the Israeli and in turn, the Israeli is part of the larger Middle Eastern and global economy. So Google, Microsoft, all of them, they make tens of billions of dollars in profits, propping up apartheid Israel, but also now in genocide. And of course, worldwide, we're seeing the digital-driven global restructuring, a new round of restructuring and transformation of the whole global economy and society through these new digital technologies. So they're being inaugurated in Gaza with this genocide, especially three I want to mention: Lavender, Gospel, and Where's Daddy? So Gospel targets buildings and structures, not individuals. These are not human beings. This is artificial intelligence driving itself. And so if Israel says there's a Hamas militant in some building, or a Hezbollah militant, member in some building in Lebanon, it's identified by Gospel, not by human beings, by Gospel. And then Gospel targets the building, and all the Israelis do is drop a 2,000-pound bomb or blow up the building. Doesn't matter that you killed 200 civilians to get, and even if it's true, to get one Hamas or one Hezbollah member. So that's Gospel. Lavender uses machine learning, which means it can create its own algorithmic learning process to create a mass database of artificially intelligent selected targets. So it's the artificial intelligence that selects the targets. All the Israelis do is then just whatever AI says, press the button. So Where's Daddy tracks through mobile phones. So we know about Pegasus, how you don't even need to click on the link. They can get Pegasus into your phone and then have access to everything. But Where's Daddy takes it a step higher, and now it's being inaugurated and the dry run in Gaza. So as one Israeli military spokesperson put it, it's really like a data-driven mass assassination factory. Once you go automatic, target generation goes crazy. So I want to make a comment here. The genocide now becomes ghastly efficient, which is why my co-author and I used that term ghastly in the article we recently wrote. You remember that, some of you might remember, I believe it was 1941, and I don't remember the exact year, but the Nazis had this famous meeting where everyone but Hitler was there, the top 20 most famous, notoriously famous Nazi leaders. They met for 2 days in a resort mansion, and they discussed how, well, we have to now exterminate all of the Jews. We have to find the most efficient way to do so. And that's why then they came up with concentration camps, which would have gas chambers. So now what we're seeing with this AI in Gaza is really the Nazi comparison is very relevant here. The Zionists, the Israelis are saying, what is the most efficient way to conduct this genocide? And it's now through this AI. So to go back and quote again that military spokesperson, even if an attack is averted, you don't care. You immediately move on to the next target. Because of the system, the targets never end. You have another 36,000 waiting. So this is really the key point, that Israeli genocide is a warfare testing ground and practice one for capitalist states around the world in this new age of artificial intelligence and digital technologies. And that's why one White House official said regarding Lavender and Gospel, other states are going to be watching and learning. So once again, we have this relationship to the global crisis and what you do with surplus humanity, and we have the implications for Gaza's implications for all of humanity, the global meaning of Gaza. The fourth of these six is that a global capitalism in crisis, with a severe crisis of surplus capital, and desperately, where can you unload that surplus capital? You have enormous pressures built up in the global economy for violent capitalist expansion. And in this context, the whole Middle Eastern region assumes outsized importance, because it has been in recent years a major outlet for that surplus accumulated capital. And that is why the World Economic Forum has two meetings every year. One meeting is in Davos, the other is in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. It's called Davos in the Desert, how to dramatically expand the integration and the availability of unloading surplus capital in the Middle East. So genocide becomes a mechanism of primitive accumulation. The limits to expansion must be overcome by technologies of death and destruction, because it is Palestine and Gaza in particular that is blocking now this dramatic expansion of capitalist globalization in the Middle Eastern and North African region. So this globalization in the Middle East really takes off after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and intensifies every year since. We used to speak about an Arab-Israeli conflict, and that phrase is a complete anachronism now. It corresponded to the period from 1948 to 1967, when Arab nationalism and socialism was on the rise in the era of decolonization, and the Arab response to Israel was fighting what's a colonial project against them and against their nationalism and their socialism. The 1970s is the last big structural crisis before the one we're in now. And we have the financialization of the global economy. We have the oil prices going up, and that changes everything in the Middle East. The 1980s and on, we have globalization and transnational capitalist class formation around the world, but specifically I'm referring here to the Middle East and North Africa. And that 1980s and on is the context for Oslo and a would-be Palestinian bourgeoisie controlling their own masses. So the 1980s and on, what do we see? And accelerating in the 21st century, that Israeli capital becomes integrated with Gulf capital and with transnational capital from all over the world. We see this massive entrance of corporate financial investment throughout the Middle East in energy, tourism, high-tech, construction, infrastructure, finance, luxury consumption. The sovereign wealth funds now massively involved in this. So the whole region becomes integrated amongst themselves, including Israel and the Arab countries, and integrated into the globalized circuits of accumulation. That is why this phrase, Western imperialism, misses the point. Now, yes, it is US, UK, and Germany, especially US and Germany right now, more than anyone else, which is sponsoring the genocide, which is really, again, it's a transnational genocide. But you still miss the point when you don't see what's going on here at the level of globalized capitalism, the transnational capitalist class, and the role also of the regional states in this. So common transnational capitalist class interests trump any political considerations among the ruling classes, well, worldwide, but specifically in the Middle Eastern region. So Arab political and economic elites, they are not friends of the Palestinians. They are, on the contrary, the enemy of the Palestinians, these regimes, especially the Gulf regimes, but also Egypt, also Jordan, etc. And they are very concerned about facing the Arab poor working class masses who are very restless and who want to have their government support Palestine. And that's why in Saudi Arabia, you can't raise the Palestinian flag. It's dangerous to do so. That's why the Jordanian government is attacking their own population when they have pro-Palestinian marches. So Palestine is a thorn in the side for Arab ruling classes. Egypt normalized relations with Israel in 1980, Jordan in 1994. Then came the Abraham Accords in 2020, where the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, also Morocco and Sudan, normalized relations with Israel. And then Saudi-Israeli normalization was already well underway. It was supposed to be completed at the end of 2023. That was the clincher. That was going to pave the way for this massively increased regional integration into itself, within itself, and to the larger global capitalism. And it was supposed to be a big change in the Middle East. And then the attack happens on October 7th, and that whole project is put on hold. So it's crucial to understand also in this context that normalization means not just economic normalization, but also the Saudi, with being the clincher, would cement the region-wide oppressive political and social order itself. So we have to be clear here that Gulf capital involving trillions in sovereign funds and other types of investment is mixing together with capital from Israel and from all over the world, from the EU, from North America, from Latin America, from Asia. By the way, China is now the region's principal trading partner and a major investor in Israel and in the whole region. And the Chinese-based capital pouring into there mixes up and integrates with Western-based and capital from Latin America and elsewhere mixing up in there. We're talking about transnational capital. There's real geopolitical conflict between states, but we have to distinguish between states and capital and really analyze what's going on with state policies. So the Middle East, Asia corridor is now a major conduit for global capital. So that is why we are talking more than old-fashioned settler colonialism. We are looking at the barbarous face of a global capitalist system that can only reproduce now through bloodshed, dehumanization, torture, and extermination. And that's what we're seeing in Gaza. So some people, in my view, very confused or pathetic political position and lacking any serious analysis of global capitalism, seem to think that the BRICS are a friend of Palestinian liberation. And here we need to separate diplomatic rhetoric versus transnationally integrated capital. Yes, the BRICS are not sponsoring the genocide. Yes, they diplomatically oppose it, but that is a deeper point. Russia is, as we speak, is the #1 supplier of coal to Israel. South Africa, the #2 supplier. Brazil supplies 9% of Israeli oil. India provides military equipment to Israel for Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon. Israel's main port, Haifa, was privatized to the Shanghai International Port Group and to Adani. China-Israeli trade reached in 2023 a record high of $20 billion in the midst of genocide. Depending on what data you use, China is either the #1 or the #2 trading partner of Israel. South Africa's leading arms dealer, Ivor Ichikowitz, he's one of the biggest donors to the African National Congress. He operates a military joint venture with Elbit Systems, which is the biggest military-industrial high-tech complex in Israel. So I ask here, does this explain why no BRICS have imposed economic sanctions on Israel or cut diplomatic ties? Now, if China imposed an economic sanctions on Israel, the Israeli economy would spiral into a collapse very quickly, undermining its ability to conduct this genocide. Now, I'm not saying that China's leading the genocide, but again, transnational class interests and economic interests trump anything else. So we see around the world, because again, the global meaning of Gaza. Here we see on the left, top and bottom, we see the Russia-Ukraine war. On the right, we see genocide in Gaza. These are transnational conflicts and also transnational impulse towards extermination. We do have escalating geopolitical confrontation. These are wars and conflicts around the world for resources, for profit-making, for state competition, all responses to capitalist crisis and collapse, wars to contain mass revolt from below. And here's what we're seeing, which is so scary. Whole regions within countries are collapsing, whole states are collapsing, not just looking at Sudan, look at Haiti, look at other parts of Mexico, look at parts of Colombia. All over the world, we're seeing the rise of new political and military mafias, cartels, criminal gangs, corrupt cliques, and they take over political, administrative, terrorizing in these regions they're coming to control, and they do so in consort with transnational capital. That's critically important. In parts of Mexico where the cartels have military and terrorizing havoc, the cartels, in those regions where there's less official government and more cartels, transnational capital is not touched. It comes in perfectly peacefully and protected by this. So again, we see Gaza as the face of something going on in the larger global capitalism. Of course, that's Congo with this incredible wealth and all of those military political forces coming in. Mainstream media says it's different political factions competing for influence, but no. What's going on in the Congo, all of these scenes are from the Congo, where 7 million have been displaced, 6 million killed, are transnational wars by global capitalists and states to seize resources. The local political military forces get a little bit of the cut for doing the on-the-ground dirty work. And so once again, Congo is linked to Palestine. Palestine is shining a mirror to us and saying, this is what's going on in the world. This is the future of the world. So Netanyahu, many of you will recognize this, has this map sent 22 of September 2023 at the General Assembly, holds up that map saying this is going to be the new Middle East. And you see this much deeper integration, starting with India through Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Gulf states, and into Europe via Greece. So Gazans stand in the way of transnational capitalist expansion. Transnational capital accumulation through genocide is now supposed to pave the way for a new round of extractive, industrial, financial, and commercial investment in the region. You see there the gas and oil deposits in Gaza, around Gaza, off Gaza's shores, which is Palestinian resources, but of course, you have to get rid of the Palestinians so they can be seized not just by Israel, but by transnational capital. So once again, Palestinians are surplus humanity standing in the way of major global capitalist expansion. They're being resuscitated, these plans for the Ben Gurion Canal, which would be an alternative to the Suez Canal. And then you see, I want to say something about this. We are nearing the end. I guess we lost some important time when I lost connection. But this is the Nazarene corridor and the US pier. So again, so regret that my Apple pens, I can't circle anything, but if you look at that Gaza on sort of the top right quadrant, you see the Nazarene corridor. What the Israelis did, and it cuts right through. The Israelis did is they literally just pulverized and turned into dust 300 meters on either side of that corridor. That's going to be their permanent point in which they militarily occupy and now control Gaza. And then you see on the left that futuristic image. That is an image of some Israeli economic groups saying that's what we're going to turn Gaza into, and that's right by the Nazarene corridor. And then all the way on the right-hand side in the center, you see an Israeli real estate company showing how they're going to build upscale housing for Jews after all the Palestinians are gone and the genocide is over. And then finally, you see the U.S. port and if anyone in the world believed that was really constructed to bring humanitarian aid, they are, with all due respect to them, unbelievably ignorant, because that's not what it was built for. And that port, that military naval port, is right at the edge, right there, of the Nazarene corridor. So there's this U.S. Israeli military plans here in the works for genocide, post-genocide. So I'm concluding now, a couple other PowerPoints to conclude. We really have this, I want to go back to this global intifada in solidarity with Palestine and point out there's this unprecedented crackdown. I don't have time, but you guys are experiencing, especially if you're in Germany, and especially if you're in the United States, the UK also. Unprecedented repression and crackdown. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you what's going on here. My students are facing kidnapping charges. You wouldn't believe it, because they're involved in an encampment, and some people left the encampment. And I'm not exaggerating. My own graduate student, who's one of the key organizers for our encampment, is facing kidnapping charges, felonies that could lock her up for decades. So this unprecedented crackdown. Why? Because it is a response to the unprecedented upsurge of Palestine solidarity. The Zionist narrative is cracking, and U.S. policy is being threatened like never before. So Israel and the United States, they control the military battlefield, but they've already lost the battle for political legitimacy. I've been involved in Palestine solidarity for 20 some odd years, and this is a qualitative turning point. That's what I started this presentation with. Universities have been, this might change, hopefully it will, because we need the working class and unions to get involved. And lead acting alone, we need to be really clear, they're simply agents of it's the Israeli and US state and transnational corporate capital which has been organizing this repression, whether it is on our campuses here or in the larger society, whether it's in Germany, etc. I won't go into all of these operations originating from the US and Israeli states and from transnational corporate offices that repressive operations we've been facing. But universities are the brain trust for the military-industrial complex, for tech capital, for finance. We've had a privatized university. They're now being financed first by tuition, so tuition skyrocketed, but by corporate and private donors. And so here in the United States, Israel in recent years has given nearly $400 million to the university endowments. Those endowments become a major outlet for accumulating and investing capital around the world, in turn, specifically in Israel and in the Middle East, North North Africa region. And so boycott, divestment, sanctions become a tremendous threat to corporate interests, not just to Israel. That's the point I want to make here, that US policy towards the whole Middle East, North African region hinges on propping up Zionist Israel, and the mass protest movement in the United States and around the world is a threat to these transnational capitalist interests. So Palestine solidarity has to be criminalized. We see these brutal scenes of the German police literally cracking the heads open of peaceful German protesters and all of these attacks. This is the larger story. They're not just doing the bidding for Israel. In January of 2024, this year, Palantir, which is a major Silicon Valley high-tech corporation, they agreed to a strategic partnership with the Israeli Ministry of Defense to supply technology to the IDF for use in Gaza. And in fact, Palantir CEO Alex Karp was interviewed in the middle of our encampments here. He said, "What do you think of these university protests?" He said, "We think college campus protests are a sideshow." No, they are the show. If we lose the intellectual battle, we will not be able to deploy any army in the West ever. So here you see the stakes involved. What is going on in Israel and the US is really combating this is the front lines. Well, both in Israel and the US is the front lines of 21st century fascism, but it's also the front lines of the fight back against it. And what we're seeing now is the mobilization of transnational fascist mobs in Amsterdam and in Los Angeles, but all around the world, we're going to increasingly be seeing this. There's what happened in Amsterdam, let the IDF win to F the Arabs, part of the longest song, there's no schools in Gaza because there's no children left. There was a massive we can only call it a transnational psychological operation when the corporate media and the governments of the world said, oh, this is terrible anti-Semitic pogrom in Amsterdam. What you actually had was transnational fascist stormtroopers attacking in Amsterdam. And on the bottom right, what you see is the UCLA campus, University of California, Los Angeles campus. Several hundred peaceful student protesters, totally peaceful. It's about 1 a.m. on April 30 of this year. Many of them were sleeping, some were singing, a few of them were eating, they had little study groups. Suddenly, this fascist mob of several hundred, including former IDF soldiers, Zionists, US-based Zionists, former cops, former police, and far-right Christian nationalists, they all stormed and they violently attacked for several hours. 100 were sent to the hospital. The police stood by and watched. So now we're seeing really that the new fascism is not national fascism, but transnational fascism. And again, the ground zero is US and Israel for what is coming, what is already here. The global future is at stake in Palestine. Battle lines being drawn in Middle East reflect global battle lines. Again, October 7 was what we call a catalytic event. Trumpism now brings us to a new stage in this. Will Israel become a model for how ruling groups deal with global surplus humanity? Will it become a model for global genocide? Will it pave the way for a global fascism? So I've already spoken about these unprecedented global inequalities. If we want to push forward this anti-genocide struggle and not have that future, this nightmarish future, and this is simply a political statement, I don't have the answer about how we do this, but we need to, unions and the working class really need to become involved and link it to their own struggles. We need student worker alliances. We need alliances of anti-genocide with environmental justice movement. This is happening already. It's already happening. We need class analysis and anti-capitalist critique if we really want to understand this big picture. There is a global revolt underway. Unrest is escalating everywhere. Mass disaffection is simmering below the surface. The whole globe is a tinderbox. The ruling classes fear mass uprisings, and they are preparing for them. So criminalizing Palestine solidarity and repressing that is a dress rehearsal for mass repression. Again, we've seen brown shirts, Amsterdam attacks now on US government saying they're going to attack anyone that dares to support the ICC ruling. So the global correlation of political and class forces here hangs in the balance. And the outcome of this anti-genocide battle is really going to shape what comes next. Will fascism win or popular mass struggle from below? And I want to, this is the second to last slide, I'll say this, and then the last slide is just an image. So global capitalism is in this deep crisis, and we are faced the specter of World War III. But we want to remember something. World War II did not begin when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. It really begins with the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. Had fascism lost out in Spain, had the Republic and the left won in Spain, we may not have had World War II, or at least how we had it. So I'm suggesting to you that this struggle against genocide and the genocide unfolding is really going to shape what comes next worldwide, and if we move into World War III and global fascism. So Palestine is a symbol of popular rage and global intifada against global capitalist status quo.
Thank you very much, William, for this tour de force